Dreams may not die, but sometimes they are reborn. So a number of folks have been asking me for a little bit now, hey, have you watched Netflix's Sandman yet? You're going to do a review for Netflix's Sandman, and now I'm going to do this instead, which is going to serve as kind of a review. But honestly, I realized as I was finishing up, I have a lot more to say than just, I liked it, this was good, or I didn't like it, this was bad. I've got a lot more complicated feelings on this, particularly in terms of how it is as an adaptation. Because I went into this openly nervous. I was actually increasingly skeptical, as not only the trailers, but like little behind the scenes snippets, Neil Gaiman talking, as that stuff was coming out, I was getting more and more and more nervous. I am happy to say that I'm very happy with this series, and it's an excellent adaptation. I'm not going to say I was wrong to be nervous, though, because that had to do with how it was marketed. And a lot of the marketing put a lot of emphasis on how faithful to the original work it was.
Now this shot, it's exactly the same shot as the comics, although it is flipped.
That had me very worried because, well, a number of reasons. One, I like the original a lot, and it's very much tailored to the medium it was originally told in. If you want to know how that can impact things, I did a lengthy breakdown of Zack Snyder's Watchmen movie, which is badly flawed largely because of how much it pulls directly from the comics when it's pulling moments that were designed to work on the page and they just don't work as well in the new medium. So that's part of why I was nervous. In addition to that, we've already had a super loyal adaptation in the form of the Audible audio dramas, which I've also reviewed. You can check that out there. Well, I've reviewed the first one. I haven't gotten to the second one yet. I'm trying to catch up on some other stuff. But my point is that the idea of a super loyal adaptation of this, I actually didn't have a lot of interest in that. And because all the marketing was putting all the emphasis on, hey, look, this shot is pulled directly from the comics. Oh, here's a line in the trailer. That's exactly the line from the comics. And I was getting very nervous.
Tell us what power of dreams can have.
I was getting very nervous that this was going to be more interested in being loyal than being well adapted. That is not the case. This is fantastically adapted. It does, in my mind, what any adaptation of a work like this should do, which is whenever something isn't necessarily going to work in the new medium, you change it. Whenever you come across something that, you know what, maybe that wasn't the best choice originally, or maybe that aspect hasn't aged well, you change it. Whenever you come across something that's like, you know, we could just do something a little bit different that doesn't fundamentally alter it, but just gives it a slightly different flavor. You do that. But you also keep a lot of the specifics. You keep a lot of the exact dialogue where it makes sense to do so. You keep some of the same exact visuals, but you take opportunities to do other things. It's been treated, or like in conversation, it gets treated like a zero-sum game. Either, well, you just throw the original out and do your own thing, or you are super loyal to the word. No, the best stuff falls in the middle. And this is a really good adaptation because that is exactly what it does. Now, short version is, I like this a lot. It is good in the same ways that the original comic was good, but it does the necessary alterations to come up to the times, to work better in the medium it's in, to not lean on some stuff that it just isn't able to do. And I will get into more specifics about what I mean by all that. But I'm just saying this up front because I'm going to get into spoilers pretty much right off the bat, because I want to talk nuts and bolts about the ways in which this was adapted and the ways in which these decisions were very smart decisions for the new medium that they were working in. even sometimes when they were decisions where their hands were probably forced in one way or another. But I want to talk about that openly. And I don't want to have to try and figure out how to dodge around that and, I'll do spoilers later. No, I'm talking everything we see in here. So what that means spoiler-wise is spoilers for this season of the show, which also, because this is what gets adapted, that means I'm also going to be talking spoilers for the first 2 volumes of the comic itself. So that's Preludes and Nocturnes and The Doll's House. So if you have never read those, if you haven't seen the thing yet, I'm just going to be talking about this stuff openly. So be aware. I think it's good. I think you should see it. Okay, here we go. In terms of specific adaptational changes, one thing that I'm basically not going to dwell on is any alterations in race or gender. I know that's something that some people have decided to, not only at the time of casting announcements, but still up to now, make a big deal about the fact that a black woman is playing Death, a woman is playing Lucifer, a woman is playing a different version of Constantine, it's not even John Constantine, etc., etc. None of this I'm going to dwell on because I think they cast good actors who play the roles well. None of these alterations are actually core to who these characters were as people, as characters, as far as I am concerned. So that I'm not even going to dwell on. I'm simply going to acknowledge that I'm not going to dwell on it. But as it was going forward, I found myself cataloging, because I know these comics quite well. I need to emphasize, I really like Sandman comics. But as it was moving forward, picking up on the things that were different or new became one of my favorite things about it. But it wasn't like, ooh, they changed it. Why'd they change that? It was like, ooh, they changed that. That's interesting. Because like I said, if it had been a 1-for-1, I would have been very bored. I would have been incredibly bored and really frustrated and very disappointed. But it wasn't. And also, let me be clear, when I talk about this being an excellent adaptation, I mean of the kind of story it is. When it comes to different types of stories, you can do adaptation different ways. So for example, I actually think the Marvel movies are pretty decent adaptations because they're taking characters that have been running for so long that they rarely adapt specific stories beyond anything more than just the broadest strokes. What they focus in on is adapting the characters well, not so much about the stories. And I think for that, it's a good approach. Here, you need to adapt the story because it's a story about stories. It's a story about why stories matter. So you kind of need to focus in and know what you're doing. And this does. The first major thing that I noted was that the Corinthian gets introduced pretty much immediately. In the comics, he does not come into play until the second volume, until The Doll's House. He, I think, gets referenced prior to that, but he does not appear. He shows up almost immediately here, and his presence is reasserted at a few points. This is very smart. Now, normally I'd say you're bigging him up as a villain more than is necessary. Why are you doing that? No, I knew exactly why they were doing that. Because whereas the volumes of the comic were an ongoing thing and did not have to necessarily have a big, massive climax at the end of things. In fact, some things are very much deliberately anti-climaxes. Actually, the defeat of the Corinthian in the comics is kind of a deliberate anti-climax in a lot of ways. They build it up a bit more here because the nature of the medium, the nature of television, the nature of a continuing story you're telling over multiple episodes, ending at the end of a season that may or may not get more after this, needs a stronger climax than what was designed in the comics. And so things are done at the end to up the threat of the Corinthian because of some of the other stuff that he does that is new, like the way in which he gets hold of and tries to utilize Rose Walker. That's new. But introducing him earlier also gives us a steady build to him. And it makes it feel more like a continuing story as opposed to 5 episodes that tell a pretty complete story of Dream being captured, freed, and then retrieving his tools. 4 episodes at the back end telling the story of Rose Walker, the Vortex, and how the Corinthian gets dealt with, and 1 episode in between those 2 arcs as a bit of a buffer. Instead of that, by putting the Corinthian in earlier and giving us reminders, having him be a presence, it makes it feel more like a continuous piece than it would have in a more loyal adaptation. Then I also mentioned and alluded to, there's some stuff that I think they really had no option but to alter it because of rights stuff. Now you have to remember that Sandman in the comics originally was in the DC universe proper. I think technically he was all the way through, but like overall, it actually meant something in the beginning. Like the character of John Dee in the comics is Dr. Destiny, who was an established villain. The facility he's held in the comics is Arkham Asylum. Scarecrow makes an appearance. There are appearances by the Martian Manhunter. There's John Constantine, here reimagined as Joanna Constantine. There is things that go on with the original Sandman, Hector Hall, all completely reimagined, done over in different ways. I'll come back to Hector and Lyda Hall in a little bit, but all these things probably had to be changed because of rights issues. Because when you are licensing out the rights to Neil Gaiman's Sandman, these other characters appeared in it, but they were not created for it. So they require separate licenses if you're going to include them. Not to mention the fact that I think your average watcher of the TV show would have been incredibly confused if Scarecrow or the Martian Manhunter or even John Constantine showed up. So those changes were probably largely required by not needing to license the rights to more than just the Sandman stories. But they're still well handled. They're still well adapted. Joanna Constantine is effectively a feminized version of John Constantine. Not completely. Like, Jenna Coleman is able to bring in a little bit of her own flavor as a performer where it doesn't just feel like she's being the same character straight up, but she bears a similar backstory. She's filling a very similar function, and I think she works well. I think it's worth noting at this point, I think pretty much all the performances are quite good, including the ones that I was paranoid I wouldn't like. So again, if you watch some of my earlier stuff, I was paranoid that I wasn't going to like The Corinthian or Desire, which were 2 performances I didn't particularly care for in the audiobook adaptation. And the reason is very self-centered, and it's a performer's problem, which is that those are both parts that I would like to play. And since those are characters I would like to play, I tend to be very judgmental of someone who did get to play them because part of my brain is liable to go, I could have done that better. And I didn't feel that about either of them. Neither Desire nor The Corinthian left me going, I could have done that, or I could have done that even better. I did feel that a little bit with the audiobook, but I didn't feel that here with this. I think they were both well done. The show was very smart about what sort of flavor moments it chose to keep. So like, for instance, Cain and Abel appear. Now, Cain and Abel are kind of iconic if you've read The Sandman, but narratively, they don't really need to be there. They don't really matter. Cain will matter a little bit later on, assuming that further stories get adapted, but between the 2 of them, they're just always kind of there. They are flavor to the dreaming. And they're here because they are appropriate flavor for the kinds of inhabitants that are there. Now, I did note that they kept those 2. They did not carry over Eve. And probably, if I were to guess why, if I were to try and explain to you Eve as a actual character, as a personality from the comics, I don't have a lot. She doesn't stick in your head the way Cain and Abel do. But those 2, you'd very much feel their absence if they weren't there as a fan of these things. So keeping them makes an awful lot of sense. But there's also some alterations to characters that I think had nothing to do with anything related to rights or anything like that. That were just changes that it was decided this would be a good idea. One was an expansion of a character who, if I remember correctly, doesn't really appear at all and is really only referred to. And another is a consolidation of two characters into one new character. So the first is Ethel Cripps. That is the woman who steals all the stuff from the Magus, who had captured Dream, and who later gives birth to John Dee and passes on the ruby to him. She's effectively a non-character. She's referred to in the original, but she doesn't appear. Here, giving her a personality, letting us see her with John before his escape from the facility that he's being held in, gives us a chance to get a sense of him through her. And it helps us relate to John even before we get to know him. I say relate, not necessarily sympathize or empathize with, because I'll kind of come back to that. But the other character, who's a consolidation and amalgamation, is Galt, who is a nightmare, a shape-shifting nightmare, missing from the dreaming. She's missing along with the Corinthian and Fiddler's Green. Now, the Corinthian and Fiddler's Green are in the comics. In the comics, though, there's no Galt. Instead, there is Brute and Glob, who don't really matter and never come back after this particular story. And I think it was a wise idea to consolidate their narrative function into a single new character who could be used to put some strain on Lucian and Dream's relationship, to kind of force them into a conflict that was, I think, understandable, and to have her return mark a little bit of a shift in Morpheus, in Dream. So I think that was a really wise idea, because I don't know anyone who would have been clamoring for Brute and Glob to come back. Now, I said I'd come back to John Dee. There's a lot of very small but very smart changes to characters that alter the way that the audience is going to connect and relate to them. So with John, there's the whole thing with Rosemary, who picks him up off the road, drives him to where he wants to go. In the comics, she's nice. She drops him off, and he shoots her. And I remember watching as he reached into his jacket, and I expected him to pull out a gun. He was going to shoot her. He didn't. He pulled out the protection necklace that he had, and he gave that to her. Now, for fans like me who already know the comics, this is like, that's an interesting change. And for people who don't know what's coming next, it sets you up for a massive gut punch, because the episode after this is 24/7. And that episode is a pretty loyal adaptation of an issue of that comic. By taking that change and not having John kill Rosemary, you start to think, oh, he doesn't seem like that bad a guy. And like up to that point, the people that he had killed were all people who had tried to shoot him, tried to hurt him. He was effectively acting in self-defense. So you start to think, maybe he's not that bad. And then we get to 24/7, where he goes into the diner and makes people be honest, be who they truly are, and then push that much further than they would ever be to get the worst and the cruelest outcome that he can. And that whole thing is unsettling no matter what, but I think it makes it hit harder that instead of a glimpse at his cruelty by killing Rosemary, we get a glimpse of kindness to then be followed by this. A number of other small things which work as very wise adaptational choices. So the serial convention, there's the character of Funland. And Funland is a child murderer, definitely. Child molester, possibly. It's implied. But in the comics, he is dealt with unsettlingly gently. Here he's just killed, which is much, much more appropriate for who this guy is and what he does. He was kind of treated with kid gloves in the comic. I think because he himself was kind of childlike, but like he kills kids. I don't care if he's childlike. He should not have been handled as softly and delicately as he was in the comics. And this seems to agree because they just kill him. Good. By a similar token, we have Alex, who is the person who is more or less in charge of the place where Dream has been held for, well, in this version, over 100 years, because they moved the timeline up to match with actual time that things are now happening. And in the comics, Dream is quite cruel. Now, Dream still punishes him in the show, but he gives him the gift of, I believe he calls it eternal sleeping. What he does to him in the comic is to give him eternal waking. Because you ever have that thing where you're in a nightmare? Let me be clear, not a dream, a nightmare. And you think you wake up and then realize you're still in the nightmare. That's what Dream did to Alex in the comics, and he did it to him forever. And given that Alex was not the guy who actually put him in that cage, he did not release him. So, like, I get some level of vengeance, but it always did seem a little bit crueler than maybe it should have been. And this goes just a little softer, which again feels like a wise adaptational choice, especially because just by virtue of having Dream be played by a human being, he's going to be a little bit more humanized. Because in the comics, the way he's drawn, especially in the face and the eyes, is a bit more off-putting than you're going to get from, frankly, any human actor, unless you do some serious CGI augmentation, which they did not opt to do. I mentioned moving forward the timeline, which was an interesting choice. That was something that I actually would have said they didn't need to do. They could have just made this a period piece and have it set the bulk of it in the 80s, which was when the comic was going out at the time for the chunk of the comics that this covers. I think they could have perfectly gotten away with that and just kept the timelines as is, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't. They move things forward. And that gives us little things like the small alteration to the regular meetings between Dream and Hob, where in the comics, Dream never misses their appointment. In this one, he does, by necessity, because of how long he now has been locked up with the altered timeline, because they're still keeping him being captured in 1916. That you can't really move because they tie it to the sleeping sickness, which was an actual thing that happened. So you actually can't really move that. But if they're moving his point of freedom way later, by about 40 years, a little less than 40, 35-ish, I don't know, I can't remember what year the first issue came out, 30 some odd years forward, yeah, no, he's missing that appointment. And what was funny to me is how little they had to actually change to acknowledge that.
I've always heard it impolite to keep one's friends waiting.
That's the same line in the comics. It's just the difference is this time he is genuinely years late. He wasn't in the comics. But that acknowledgement of Hob as a friend is still there, as it should be. And actually, I think that episode is my favorite episode because they blend together the introduction of Death as a character. And she's beautifully done, I thought. And we have that, and then have that bleed over into Hob, and having her as kind of the bridging point for that makes sense. And then watching Dream reconnect, getting the backstory of him and Hob, and then seeing him reconnect after having had this conversation with his sister Death. Putting those two in the same space works shockingly well I would have thought they were a little too isolated, self-contained, but no, they work shockingly well, both of them. Some other small adaptational changes that really feel like strong concessions to the new medium it's in. Despair. We don't see a lot of her, but in the comics, so like if you've only seen the show, Despair is, kind of, in a dumpy sweater. She looks like someone who hasn't left their apartment in a while. They are too sad to leave the house. In the comics, she's naked all the time. And I actually do think it works in the comics. The way that her appearance and her nakedness is done is something that feeds into her portrayal as a character. And for me, it never really came across as exploitative, and it's certainly not drawn to be titillating. But the thing is, by taking not a piece of art, not a very exaggerated Despair is very malformed in a lot of ways. And there's a conversation to be had about whether that is ableist. I'm not really sure I want to go there. I will say, at least to the best of my knowledge, her physical shape, especially combined with like what's going on with her jaw and some other stuff in the comics again, does not appear to be like a direct correlation to any conditions, at least that I know about. But again, that's kind of a separate conversation. But what I will say is that, she's drawn that way to a very specific effect in the comics that would not have played the same if they'd had her be naked in the show. Because by virtue of having an actual person with, even someone, with a similar body shape to Despair in the comics, just having an actual person be naked as opposed to this abstracted concept as she is in the comics, it gives it an entirely different feel because it's lacking the distancing effect of it being artwork. And having it be a real person feels exploitative in a way that the comics just don't. And so I think that was a very wise choice to actually just put her in clothes. Now, Lyta and Hector Hall actually go through some very significant changes. Again, partially due to rights reasons with these characters, especially with Hector. But they also build up Lyta a bit more, and they give Lyta more of a sense of truly clinging to this. Because like in the comics, Lyta has just been in the dreaming with Hector for decades. And how aware she is of it is a little bit up and down, but that's kind of just been her life. Whereas here, Hector is something she's already lost. So when she finds him in the dreaming, this is something she's regaining. And I think that is a way to make her anger towards Dream for taking that away from her. Something that she's already gone through the loss of and she thought she could have again. When he takes that away from her, her anger makes a bit more sense. Not that her anger was unjustified in the comics, but it gives you a stronger anchor. And given what goes on with her later on, assuming they get to adapt it, I think that's a good, strong choice. Now, I'm going through praising all these alterations and all these changes. There was one choice that I'm not sure why they did it, and I think it was a mistake. And that has to do with Lucifer. So, in the comics, when Dream goes to hell to retrieve his helm, and he confronts Corazon, who has his helm, and he challenges him to, quote-unquote, the oldest game. In the show, Corazon names Lucifer as his champion. So Dream has to then confront Lucifer. In the comics, he just confronts Corazon. Now, Lucifer oversees it. At the end of it, Lucifer still threatens Dream in the same way, in a "why should I let you leave" manner. But the meaning is now completely changed by having Dream actually defeat Lucifer. I don't know why this change was done. I think they're trying to shore up and firm up a rivalry between Lucifer and Dream. I think it's deeply unnecessary and it weakens Lucifer as a character. Because first of all, it makes Lucifer seem like less of a threat if Dream has effectively already defeated him. him, them. I actually don't know if they used pronouns for Lucifer in this. I'm going with them. But to see that Dream is already defeated, it already lessens the sense of danger. How dangerous are. Now, granted, it's an atypical confrontation, but it feels like it undercuts the idea that Lucifer is significantly more powerful than Dream. That's the first problem. The second is, it makes that moment when Lucifer says, "Why should we let you leave?" It takes that and turns it from a moment of just, oh, right, this is the devil, we can't trust them, which is what it is in the comics, because Lucifer is very polite, very accommodating, doing the whole, oh, well, there are rules, there are procedures, but is very polite at going forward. And then suddenly goes, why should we let you leave? And it's a moment of, oh, crap, right, don't ever trust them. But in the show now, because Lucifer has just barely been defeated, instead it comes across as spiteful, as petty. It doesn't come across as calculated or like indicative of a sense of untrustworthiness. It just comes across like being a sore loser, which, again, just feels weaker. And that is the one alteration that I can think of that I think was a mistake. Every other alteration that I can think of, some of which I've talked about, some of which I haven't, like I'm not going to go through point for point. I'm going through the ones that stuck in my head and made me think about them. But all the other adaptational changes I can think of were either improvements, in some cases, honestly, kind of objectively. I think giving us more of Ethel Cripps is objectively just better. Or it was a better choice for the new medium or the times in which we now live, with alterations to things like how Dream handled Alex, how Funland was dealt with, introducing the Corinthian earlier, or worst case, I felt neutral about them. That neither hurt anything nor made it better, like with a lot of the casting alterations. I don't think that, having this person be a different gender, this person be a different race, I'm neutral on that. So every adaptation choice, I'm either like, okay, that's fine, or I'm like, that's good, or that's interesting. Except for that one thing with Lucifer. That is the one thing I'm like, I don't know why you did that. But I suppose for the purposes of analysis, it's helpful for me to have it there as a point of comparison where it's like, that really kind of is the only thing. And everything else, I'm like, these are really, really smart or interesting or well thought out adaptational changes. And even for all these changes, this is the Sandman. This feels like the Sandman. This sounds like the Sandman. This looks like the Sandman. But there are enough changes that I can watch it, and as someone who knows these comics exceedingly well, I can go, I wonder what'll be different. And it actually excites me to spot the small changes and see how it plays out just a little bit different while keeping that same core essence. And when it goes off on slightly different tangents in slightly different ways, I can know, and it's going to circle back to the stuff that I love and I wouldn't want changed. And it does. It is able to dance this dance of, I get to alternate between what's going to be the next change. And then when we're in changes like, ooh, we're going to get back to this bit that I love, that I know that they'll keep, and they do. What is changed and how they change it are incredibly well calculated, well balanced, well thought out, beautiful. I hope this gets another season. I was so happy, I think 2 episodes in, realizing how much I was loving this. Because like I said, I was skeptical. And I can be a cynical person. But I like liking stuff. And I love going in skeptical and being wrong. And I was wrong. Again, I think I was justified in my skepticism based off how it was marketed. but that skepticism was not borne out. And I really hope we get more of this. The Sandman. Hopefully we'll get a season 2. They're in the planning stages of it, but it has not officially been confirmed yet. What did you think of this first season, though? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon is what pays the bills and enables me to have these conversations with you about this stuff. Oftentimes you'll see me up here complaining, railing against some industry nonsense, but every now and then I get to talk to you about something really good. I look forward to the next time I can do that. And Patreon is what supports me and enables me to keep on doing this. But even if you can't do that, I mean, there are perks at every tier of support, but even if you can't, like, share, and subscribe help as well. But more than anything, I want you to remember that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.
Time to give my thanks to my highest supporting patrons. That would include Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Theotha Boyd, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Zach, Idolin, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Adam RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Shaylee Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. If you want your name said while these guys try and distract me, consider looking at the rewards on my Patreon.